Thank you very much for this wonderful event. It'll be fun. Gino and Jamie, I saw you somewhere, wherever you are. Jamie, are you over there? Somewhere. He might have left. I don't blame him. So this has been an amazing event. It's been an amazing time in Shanghai. And after my talk yesterday, Eva asked me to give you a talk a little bit more about our research. So we're going to cover some of the technology stuff, the transformative technology stuff, probably during a roundtable a little bit later during the day. And today, right now, we're going to go ahead and talk about this crazy research project that I've been engaged in for quite a while now. So if you're not familiar with my term persistent non-symbolic experience, or the initials PNSE, chances are you're familiar with one of the states that it's associated with. Now these are persistent, ongoing ways of experiencing the world. So things like enlightenment, awakening, mystical experience, non-duality, God consciousness, cosmic consciousness, and so on. There's hundreds of these terms that we've had people use with us and that we've cataloged. It's important to note that this is not just a religious or spiritual experience. This is not just a religious or experience shift that someone can have. It's also something that exists in a lot of atheists and a lot of agnostics, and it shows up sort of differently depending upon your belief system. So it sort of works its way through your own cultural symbols, through your own religious symbols and whatnot. But at its core, one of the things that's been very surprising about our work is that it seems to be similar at its core across people. So this is a persistent experience, meaning it's an ongoing moment-to-moment experience. I don't know anything about temporary experiences per se. There are many experts out there who study peak experiences, who study temporary experiences. I'm not one of them. I only study the persistent form of this experience, the ongoing form of this experience. Just a couple of more terms for you to be familiar with today as I go through the presentation. So the first one is PNSE, and persistent non-symbolic experience is more than a year. So you've been in this persistent ongoing flow, essentially, more than a year consistently. That was what we started off researching. And for about 7 or 8 years, that's basically all we could research. However, we eventually reached a point where we created a protocol that could shift people into this. And so at that point, I needed a new term because suddenly we had people who were in an ongoing form of this experience but hadn't been in it for more than a year. You know, literally they just like shifted into it as a result of our experiments. And so we created a second term called ongoing non-symbolic experience, or ONE, so that's less than a year, and then temporary non-symbolic experiences are like peak experiencers. They can be momentary, they can last for weeks or months or whatever. Maybe you've been in non-symbolic experience for 2 or 3 years, but then you fall out of it. That we would call that a temporary experience. Even though you were in it for a period of time, you're not in it anymore. So I want to talk a little bit about the initial study that we did, and a lot of our core data comes from this initial study, and then we've been working to validate it basically by monitoring people before, during, and after the transition to this. So we started out with about 1,200 participants worldwide, primarily English speaking, and we began the process by collecting gold standard psychology measures on them. So gold standard psychology measures are things like personality development, well-being, happiness, depression, gratitude, you name it. We just did a whole bunch of these. Developmental measures. Pretty much we just did every one we could possibly think to do to try to wrap our arms around who these people are and what makes them different than the rest of the population. Now, interestingly, in this part of the research, these actually weren't that helpful to us because people would say, you know, well, I have no anxiety or depression and I have a lot of well-being and whatnot. And they would show up in the measures, but there's nothing really special or unique about that, per se. So, however, in recent times, these have become very significant for us because we've been able to measure the differences before and after. Second, once these initial gold standard measures didn't really show that much in terms of innovative knowledge to us, the next thing that we did is we started going around and talking to these people. And so I would do in-depth 6 to 12 hour, no kidding, interviews. People would literally tell me that I had to leave. Right? And so I'd be sitting in someone's living room, and they'd be like, okay, listen, you've been here for 10 hours. I really have to go to sleep now. And I would just latch on as long as I possibly could to each one of these people because I knew I was probably never going to see them again. And so I just kept asking and asking and asking and trying to refine my understanding and be as precise as I possibly could about what they were representing to me. Now, these interviews were ultimately designed to get people to a neuroscience project. So fMRI research, EEG research, things like that. And as a result of that, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to what they were talking about in terms of their religious representations or their consciousness representations or whatnot. So some people would talk about God, some people would talk about spaciousness. Mostly I ignored all of that. And what I was interested in was this: changes in cognition, affect, which is emotion basically, memory, perception, and the sense of self. That had an interesting unintended consequence in that it made this descriptive information sort of the same across all of these different populations. So many researchers came before us in trying to talk to a Christian population, trying to talk to a Buddhist population, trying to talk to an atheist population, and trying to figure out is there any similarity or what's the differences in the terms of the consciousness and the states of consciousness between these different groups of people who are representing these advanced states or these amazing types of well-being. However, they all had mostly failed before us in doing these comparisons. And we actually didn't set out to do that, but we wound up accidentally doing that as a function of trying to sort people for neuroscience scanning by leveling the playing field by asking only these certain types of questions. And that wound up being quite revolutionary in our study. One of the things about science is that virtually everything amazing in science comes from unintended consequences and accidents. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's really, really true. The best, for instance, montage for meditation with like electrical devices that you put on your head came from an accident in Hong Kong with mislabeled electrodes from a research collaborator of mine, and it's still nothing better has been found around that, right? And so it often is these sorts of accidents that really propel science forward. And then, of course, we did the physics. We partnered with people that did fMRI and EEG. We have our own EEG stuff that we do. We did breath. We're doing some bio stuff like blood and stuff like that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what we learned from an interesting standpoint. So let me tell you a little bit about what we learned on the psychological front. I think probably it's brutal to think about our translators trying to translate neuroscience terms and things like that. So I'm going to sort of leave those things aside, and I'm going to focus mostly on the psychological changes today. So first of all, when we talk about persistent non-symbolic experience, the thing that is common across the experience, no matter where you are in the world, is that it's a fundamental shift very deep down in your psychology. Most of the world is driven by a psychology that is ultimately sort of fear-based, worry-based. It feels like there's a sense that something is lacking, that there's always this kind of fundamental, even if it's very subtle, discontent. Now, we can trace that from an evolutionary biology perspective, and I do that in other talks, but essentially it's just something that we've inherited as part of our genetic and biological basis. One of the fascinating things about a shift to persistent non-symbolic experience is that it's the only thing that we found that actually allows us to sort of free ourselves from the shackles of the biology that we've inherited for millions of years now. And so it produces a fundamental shift away from those types of things and to a fundamental place where things feel okay. There's a sense of safety. There's a sense of security. There's a sense that you don't really need to add anything to yourself. Things like that. So we call that a fundamental sense of okayness. It's okay to explore, right? You don't necessarily have to just go sit in someone's basement or on a meditation cushion for the rest of your life. It's okay to explore the world, but you're not exploring the world because you feel like you need to add something to yourself. You're not exploring the world because you feel like something is missing. There's greatly reduced or eliminated mental chatter. People often say, I have no thoughts anymore. Of course, that's not true. They do still have thoughts, but the self-referential thoughts really diminish and in many cases completely go away. So that's what I mean by reduced or mental chatter. There's, as a result of that, basically a tremendous freedom in terms of them affecting your mood and things like that. There's an increased or total focus on this moment, as Gino talks a lot about this moment and being in this moment, so we absolutely see that in the data. It's just, your thoughts aren't there constantly dragging you into the future, or constantly bringing up stuff from the past. And in fact, people often feel like they have memory deficits. So it's not uncommon for people to feel like, I don't know, I might have dementia, or I'm just worried because these these memories from the past, they just don't come up like they used to. I don't know if they're still there, right? But then I could sit with someone and interview them for 10, 12 hours, and their memories are fantastic. They just need a stimulus in order to pull them out. Their thought processes have changed, and they're no longer spontaneously having all of these thoughts from the past and whatnot being dragged up. And it's amazing how much that affects our well-being. And then there's increased sense of connectedness and possibility and what we call life flow. I talked a little bit about those yesterday. Let me talk about some of the deeper patterns. So I showed this slide yesterday, just a little bit of this, this sort of chart thing, this continuum. I'm going to talk about it today. So this is just a model. It's a way of representing different ways that people experience this. And you're going to get a sense of that as I go through these. So the first one, and it's important to note that these are not linear. In other words, you don't have to start at the first one. I talk about 4, there are many more than 4. The vast majority of people experience one of these 4 that experience persistent non-symbolic experience. And we've never seen any research subject who has landed beyond location 4. So the initial experience of this seems to always occur in one of these. However, you might never experience the first 2. Maybe the first one that you experience is the third one. And you might stay in the third one for the rest of your life. Or you might move to a different one. Traditionally, the data shows that most people would land in a spot and they would stay in that spot. However, now, because people are learning about the possibilities, they seem to be shifting more. So it's interesting how dynamic and how this process is sort of changing with the internet and exchange of information and stuff like that. All right, so location 1, you have that shift to a fundamental sense of okayness. You have that quieting down of self-referential thinking. You have emotions, especially negative emotions, falling off very, very rapidly. It seems to be as rapidly as the neurochemistry and stuff dissolves in your body. It's like there's no thought stream that's able to continue and drag on all of that negativity. So this is a great place to live from, as you might imagine. There's a tremendous sense of peace, trust in how things are. You basically decouple from your own story, like Gino talked about. You don't really care that much about your own personal history. Most of human experience is building up these narratives, in some sense that we can sell to other people to say how special we are, right? And we also sell them to ourselves to say how special we are. That basically goes away. You don't really care that much about your narrative anymore. Okay, location 2 is a little bit deeper than location 1. So a lot of those things that I said about location 1 just sort of grow in location 2. Self-referential thoughts die down more. There's a shift towards increasingly positive emotions. Negative emotions simply don't arise anymore, though they're still falling off faster. Positive emotions also will fall off faster at this point. There's also something, for those of you, and I'm not going to go into it today because of time, for those of you that are familiar with the notion of duality and non-duality, dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness, location 1 is dual, location 2 is non-dual, location 3 is dual, location 4 is non-dual. So location 2 is the first type of non-duality. Now there are different types of non-duality, but this is the first place that it enters into that model. Location 3 is the classic end of things like the Sufi mystical tradition or the Christian mystical tradition of the West. And you also see this reflected in a number of the traditions of the East. There's one single emotion remains. It has 3 different facets generally. And it feels sort of like a combination emotion, if you will. So it feels like a combination of love and joy and compassion. But it is not a personal love. It is not a personal joy. It is not a personal compassion. It's an impersonal or a dispersonal compassion. Now that can show up in 2 different ways. For some people it shows up with a sense of the divine or a sense of divinity. So this can be a powerful divine experience for some people, which is why you get it as the end of the Christian mystical path and stuff like that. However, it can also show up as not a divine experience, but as what we call the panpsychist experience. If you're not familiar with that term, it simply means the sense that everything is conscious, that it feels like sort of everything is conscious. And whether you get the divine or the panpsychist version, it feels like you're essentially merged with that. So the further and the deeper you go into location 3, the more you sort of get that merging in. And that's why it's a dual and not a non-dual location. Because if it was a non-dual location, there would be no difference between you and the divine. You can't merge with something that you already are. Right? So you can't sort of merge in with something that you are. Okay, location 4 is completely different, and it's sort of a staging ground, if you will, for locations that are further that we're not going to have time to talk about today. So in location 4, there's no sense of agency. There's no sense that you can make a decision. There's no sense that you can... The idea, even, that you could make a choice is just sort of ludicrous to you. The world just seems like it's unfolding in this synchronistic flow, if you will. You're as surprised at what comes out of your mouth as the next person is. You're not sitting there sort of planning or having some sense of what you think is you're going to experience next. Your self-referential thoughts are really completely gone at this point. Very, very, very rare when they do occur. There's no sense of the divine. That sense of the divine, or that panpsychist sense, it's totally gone. So you can imagine how dramatic that is for someone who is in location 3 and is really associated with that divine experience and then shifts somehow into location 4. It can be quite traumatic for them. They can really sort of have to get a sense of, wait a minute, what happened here? My whole worldview needs to be reconstructed. Okay, there's also, interestingly at this point, memory deficits that can come in. So if you've picked up your child at school every day at 3 p.m. for years, you're not going to forget to pick up your child. However, if you have a doctor's appointment for that child at 3:30 p.m., you're probably going to forget the doctor's appointment, unless you write a little note. So there are these interesting memory deficits that do actually come in, that are associated increasingly with location 4 and later locations. Now, you talk to people and they're like, you know, I don't really care about those. There's no way I'm trading this extraordinary way of experiencing the world to have those, to be able to remember appointments. Like I can make lists, right? It's not a big deal to me. All right, so this is the whole continuum. If anybody wants to take a picture of it all as one thing, I've noticed that people like to do that over time. So the second part of our research in the last few years, that was great research, and it was really amazing. But it was ultimately all with people who had already experienced this for a year or more, often for many decades. And so what we were wondering is, who was someone before they transitioned to this experience? What do they actually go through while they're in the experience, and who do they become after the experience? And so we needed a way to transition people. We looked all around the world, as you might imagine, with thousands of research subjects. Although it says 1,200, at this point we have thousands of research, close to 3,000 research subjects. So we knew all of the stuff from all around the world, but we couldn't find anything that was so reliable that over a very specific period of time, we could guarantee that a certain percentage of people would transition to this. And neuroscience research is very expensive. And you might spend $3,000 on someone in order to evaluate who they are beforehand. And then if that person doesn't transition, you've basically wasted your $3,000. Well, that's a lot of money to do on a scale with a lot of people. So we needed a reliable protocol for transitioning people. We drew on all of our initial research and all of that massive amount of data, and we came up with a finder's course protocol, which is a series of experiments. Now, the way we fund this, and the way we find research participants so that we get a diversity out there, is actually quite clever, I think. This has become the largest crowdsourced and crowd-funded experiment, as far as I know, in this form, in this portion of the consciousness space. We charge about $2,000 for someone to go through it. It's a 4-month online program. They go through it with a small group of 6 other people. Traditionally we allowed about 60 people into each cohort. Now we allow 150 people into each cohort. It is very time consuming for us to run and to support those people and stuff. So there's a limit on the number of people that we can allow in. And as a result of that, we've really raised over $1 million for researching this type of stuff. And that's very important because, I don't know about over here, but in America, the National Institutes of Health and the governments and the foundations and stuff, they're really not into this type of consciousness. And so to be able to bring this level of resources is really quite remarkable. The data that I'm going to show you quickly today comes from Finder's Course 1 and 2 through Finder's Course 9. Finder's Course 9 was the 9th running of it, and it ended towards the end of last year. So these are the results in terms of locations, in terms of people that successfully completed the program. You can see that we've had 231 people complete the program successfully at this point, meaning make it all the way through the 4-month process. It's a very time-consuming, it's a very intensive process. It starts at an hour and a half a day, 2.5 or even 3 hours a day. And so it's a huge time commitment. You have to be really serious about wanting this. We don't have it to a point where you can just push a button and then you can get there, right? We're working on that. We think it's possible to get there. Maybe it'll be a pill, maybe it'll be a genetic thing, who knows? We're working in that direction, but right now it's fairly time-consuming to get there. This is exactly what we would expect. So we would expect more people to transition to location 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And then these are people that didn't land in location 5 and beyond, but they landed in one of the earlier locations during the program, and then they shifted to location 5 or later afterward. So you can see our total percentage right now in terms of the success that we're having is around 74%. And that's, if you tried to do this with other workshops or retreats or whatever, you know that this is an extraordinary number. But it's, for us, an important number because it allows us to invest money at a neuroscience level and not be pissing that money away, essentially. So let me talk just a little bit about, we have hundreds, we just have so many academic measures, you couldn't believe it. I mean, I give hour-and-a-half long talks just on the academic measures data that we've collected. But I'm going to condense some of that down here for you. So this is all participants from FC2 through FC9. FC1 was the pilot. There were only 6 people in FC1, and we didn't give them all the same measures and stuff, and so that's why they're excluded from this part. And you can see the change. Now you might be saying, well, how come there's a range here? The reason for that is because oftentimes we will use multiple gold standard psychology measures rather than just one. And that's just a function of the world that I live in academically. Oftentimes when I speak to one audience, and then I speak to a different audience in the scientific academy, these audiences like and consider valid different measures. And so I have all of the measures for them. It doesn't matter what audience I talk to, I have their favorite measure. So I never have to deal with skepticism around measures or anything like that. And so when you see a range like this, it's because there's like half a dozen of the major happiness measures that are basically folded into that. I just want to totally skip all the political garbage that goes on in the academy about whether or not this or that measure is a good measure. So these are pretty good numbers, right? But this is the entire group together. So these are all of the people who transition from, who basically went through the program, not the ones who transitioned to ongoing non-symbolic experience. This is, I think, the far more interesting data, and I'm going to make this a little bit easier for you to understand. But this is the far more interesting data because this shows the difference on some of these measures between people who transitioned to ongoing non-symbolic experience and people who did not transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience. So these columns here, these are the people who transitioned to ongoing non-symbolic experience. These columns here, these are the people who did not transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience. And this is how much better, higher or lower, whichever is more appropriate, but how much better, basically, the ongoing non-symbolic experience people were versus the not ongoing non-symbolic experience. And as you look down this column, you can see these are really, there are some huge differences between these two groups. One of the things that we've had to do is essentially help people to figure out that this is, in fact, two very distinct and two completely different groups in the population. For those of you that can't read the English, I'll just briefly walk down through here. So the first line is happiness, the second line is depression, the third line is well-being, the fourth line is gratitude, the fifth line is engagement, the sixth line is happiness, the second one is another happiness measure, the third one is loneliness, the fourth one is meaning, the next one is negative, basically negative emotion, the next one, this one is percent of time happy, this one is percent of time neutral, this one is the percent of time that you have negative experience or negative emotion. This is your positive emotions. These are meaning-related ones. And so there's changes across all of these things that are the important aspects of our psychological experiences. And you can see that the changes are often much greater if you've transitioned to ongoing non-symbolic experience. And you can also see that the scores are considerably different in terms of where people end up. This is the last score. Across all of these different things, they're considerably different than where you end up if you do not report a transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience. And that's what this last column shows, is really the difference between those final scores and the level of magnitude. People often ask us, is this for everyone? Can everyone transition? And I don't know. There's about 1% or so of people who go through the experience who don't even have a temporary version of ongoing non-symbolic experience. So you can think of it as roughly 74% of people that go through, they have a shift to 1. And then all but 1% have at least a temporary glimpse of it. But that 1%, we've worked with some of them for a very long time, and we haven't gotten them to any experience of ongoing non-symbolic experience or even temporary non-symbolic experience. So it is possible that there's some genetic differences that could limit people from accessing this. We really don't know the answer to that. People also ask, well, what about, differences, like if I take the program, is there a difference between the people, how the people come in? So if I come in and I transition to 1, or if I come in and I don't transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience, are there psychological differences in those people? And in fact, there are psychological differences in those people. These are some of the psychological differences that people have. Again, since this isn't in Chinese, I'll just read it real quick. So happiness and well-being, percent of time happy versus not, the level of positive and negative emotion, the level of depression, the level of stress, the level of anxiety, level of depersonalization, absorption, mystical experience, gratitude, flow, neuroticism, extroversion. Those are all things that if you come in very low into the program, you're least likely to transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience. So an ironic thing is that happier people tend to, in our program, using our method, happier people tend to transition, whereas the most unhappy people often don't. So just to wrap up here, I want to talk a little bit about engineering this, because that's another big part of our work, is we do the transformative technology space. And so we're very interested in taking, to me, 4 months is incredible, right? It's a revolutionary thing, but it's ultimately not going to spread around the world as a 4-month online program and reach, 7, 8 billion people. So what will, right? Well, I think what will is something that we can get onto your cell phone, right? Some sort of device that you can use. And so we're also at the heart of the community that's working on that. And if you think about this, humans have been inventing these consciousness technologies for a very, very long time. Everything that's on this screen was a bleeding edge technology at the time that it was invented. I mean, this is like genius level stuff that you're viewing up here on the screen. Now, I think interestingly, as the modern scientific revolution has come around, humanity has not sort of kept up with its previous innovations in this space. We've continued to use these technologies that are very, very old and very amazing technologies, but they really haven't been updated to the present moment. You started to see a shift away from that beginning in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and these are some of the pieces of equipment, things that would monitor your heart rate or breathing or brain waves or shoot electrical signals into the brain or all of these different things. Now they look like this. They're starting to look a little less funky and a little less like they were made in the garage by your crazy uncle, and more like they're coming out of venture capital funds and whatnot, and it's because they in fact are. And so if we just look around some of these, this top one is a brain stimulation device. This is the Muse headband, which I know there's at least 1 or 2 here. I've got one with me if you want to try it, which is a brainwave feedback for meditation that uses artificial intelligence and all sorts of stuff. This, incidentally, is the same technology that I talked about earlier. When it's here, when one of the electrodes is here, right now the electrodes are here and here on that diagram, but when one of the electrodes is here and the other electrode is on the top arm, and you have the negative electrode over your temple, over your right temple, and you have the positive electrode on the top of your arm, that's a position that for an experienced meditator can often take them deeper than they've ever experienced in meditation before, just by running a simple electrical current through the brain. So this is a light and sound machine, which means that it flashes lights at a certain level in your eye and tones in your ear, and it synchronizes through something called the frequency following response. It synchronizes your brain waves in a certain way. And so we know that, for instance, alpha and theta rhythms in the brain, which are just a certain type of brain wave, are often associated with powerful meditative states. When you see that thing that Jamie talked about earlier, wherever he is, which is meditate like a Zen monk in whatever minutes, right? What they're talking about is this type of technology where you sort of put it on and it kind of tries to lock your brain to it. This is Heart Math, which is heart rate variability. That's a fantastic product. And so they were asking themselves, how can we produce awakening? And they went through brain waves and they went through all this other stuff, and they wound up spending the last 30 years or so just working on heart rate and the variability between beats of the heart as a meaningful way to sort of produce these types of states of consciousness. Let me see, this is the last one I'll probably talk about. Well, maybe I'll talk about that one too. So this one is the Spire, which is a breath tracker. This little thing here, you actually clip that inside your belt, and it tracks your breathing. And so it can tell when you're stressed out, and it sends a little alert on your phone, and it says, hey, why don't you just pause for a minute and take a little breath, or go through a little exercise with me. And so it kind of increases mindfulness. It tracks your body and sort of increases mindfulness. And then this one is about as cutting edge as it gets. There's a newer version of it. But this is ultrasound, which is the same that, when you're pregnant and you're seeing the baby in your belly or whatever. This actually is designed to go through the skull. It's called transcranial ultrasound. And if you put it over the vertex of the head, this is the latest research, if you put it over the vertex of the head, you can really sort of induce transcendent states of consciousness with this technology. If you put it on your forehead in certain different ways, you can increase your traditional happiness. But if you put it over the top of your head, they're finding some powerful effects with this in terms of the types of consciousness we're talking about. So this is all just to say that this stuff is moving ahead, and that there's all sorts of things going on all around the world in this transformative technology space. Our current version of the experiment, we're using the Muse headband. This is a heart rate strap that you wear around here that measures your heart rate and your heart rate variability. And that's a GSR device, which measures the electrical resistance in your skin. So we're collecting data through a smartphone and through an application on a smartphone with all of this while people go through the Finder's course, so that we can see physiologically, not just psychologically, but also physiologically what's changing. And what we think we're going to be able to do very, very soon is actually measure you physiologically with one or two of these devices for maybe 20 minutes, right? And then tell you very precisely which method is best for you to use in order to advance your state of consciousness. We think that we're headed towards, very shortly now, really, we're headed towards the moment where we can give you personalized prescription meditation, if you will. One of the main findings from our research project is that, first of all, not all meditation methods are created equal. Some of them work far, far better for more in the population than others. And second, even if you have a list of the very best ones, you have to figure out which one is working best for you right now. And that one might not even be the one that works best for you in a few minutes. But you have to figure out which one works best for you right now. So there's this matching problem, essentially. And you can match up and you can find for you the thing that's working right now. You can make progress very, very rapidly compared to what's been possible in the past. And so that's what we're trying to do technologically with this experiment. We think it's eventually going to be seamless and embedded into games and experiences like that. So this is an Oculus Rift. We're working on a large AR project, the first AR project that works in this area. I'd like to thank our helpers, one of which is up here on the stage, Alan Macy, who always provides us with fantastic advice. He's one of the world's best guys for physiology. And some of our other people that do data analysis with us and whatnot. This is something that really takes a large number of people to pull off. Thank you.